All right, now continuing on, we're going to talk about the war for North Africa and Italy. So, from this point, so we just discussed. Let me get to where we need to be. Sorry about that. We just discussed the the Battle of the Atlantic and Liberty ships being created, and more ships being created than Hitler could destroy, and so from there we're going to start changing our focus. And so first we're going to kind of leave the American and British part of the war, and we're going to go talk about Russia. Now, if you remember, we talked about the non-aggression pact, and Germany basically turned coat on Russia, and they will begin invading Russia from the east. So if you look very briefly here, guys, this is the stages of the Russian invasion. You can see the yellow first, and they would move to the kind of peach color, then into the purple, and then into the green. Now, right here is Moscow, and right down here is Stalingrad. Well, that's a pretty big deal because the Russians are wanting to try to push the Germans out, but they're getting closer and closer to Moscow, the capital of Russia, and to Stalingrad, which is a pretty important place because Stalingrad was surrounded by oil derricks. And so if Germany was able to capture Stalingrad, that would have been a huge bolster to their oil. All right, so the Battle of Stalingrad begins with Germany assaulting the Soviet Union, and by June of 1941, they are just outside of Moscow and outside of Leningrad, but they have to stop because they've got to wait out the very cold winter. Now, one thing that always surprises me is evidently Hitler wasn't very good at reading books, because had he been able to read things written about Napoleon, what he would have found out was that never in the history of Russia has anyone ever been able to invade Russia except the Mongols. And the reason they were able to do it is because they were from Russia. So one of the things that always seems to slow militaries down as they try to invade Russia is winters. In fact, winters in Russia are darn cold, and they're darn miserable, probably 10 times worse than winters here. So they have to stop in 1941 and into the spring of 1942 to wait out the winter. But by summer of 1942, the German troops are continuing across the Soviet Union, and they want to capture Stalingrad with the idea of capturing these oil fields, which, again, like I said, that was a pretty big deal. So August of 1942, they've surrounded Stalingrad, and they begin to send out the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, to bomb Stalingrad, and they start to destroy a lot of stuff there. So, for example, if you look in this photo, you notice this building here, the whole roof is completely destroyed. You've got this building here has been gutted. It's been gutted by fire. And then you can see most of Stalingrad is on fire here. There's a lot of smoke. This is a very famous photo if you look with some Russian troops kind of planting the Russian flag as sort of a defiance against the Germans. So anyway, by August of 42, nearly every wooden building in the city has been destroyed. So the German forces have completely surrounded Stalingrad, and they're pressing in from all sides. And that is when Stalin issues an order to his troops. He says, hey, this is my namesake city, and I do not want Germany to take it, so you have an option. You can fight until either you guys are dead or they're dead. So he orders them to fight to the death, which means that they're going to do anything within their power to try to keep from dying. So the Germans are going to come into Stalingrad thinking that they may have an easy way of invading and taking over Stalingrad, but what they find out is a lot of the Russians have holed up in all these buildings, and so the Germans have to actually go from building to building with hand-to-hand combat, clearing each and every building out. Now, of course, that takes a whole lot of time, which was a certain advantage for the Russians, because what they were doing was they were trying to keep the Germans from quickly overthrowing Stalingrad, so that way they could actually go and hold the Germans off long enough for winter to come around again. Because, as I said, winters in Russia are not fun. They're very cold, and they're terrible. So by September of 1942, Germans have control of most of the city, but then that's when winter sets in. Germans slow down. They themselves have to hunker up in the buildings in Stalingrad. And unfortunately, because most of the city was destroyed, they're not getting a whole lot of protection from those buildings. Not only that, but Germany's troops were underprepared, they were undersupplied, they were underclothed for the cold, cold winter that set in September of 42. Okay, so if you look, during the winter then, while the Germans are encamped near Stalingrad, Soviet troops come in, fresh troops and fresh tanks, completely surround the city, and they are going to make it so that the Germans are basically left with no choice. They can't get out of the city. They're stuck within the city. Now, one of the cool stories, and I always like to tell this one, is during this time when the Germans were encamped, one of the things that Russians are really good at, because they have to survive these really cold winters, one of the things they're really good at is cross-country skiing. That's, of course, why they're always so good at the Olympics with it. But during this time, the cross-country skiing Russians had figured out a great way to kind of slowly pick at the morale of the Germans. What they would do is they would send out snipers, Russian snipers on cross-country skis, and they would ski up as close as they could to a German encampment, and they would shoot as many Germans as they could. They would pick them off. Then they would turn around and ski away. And that was before the Germans would ever either A, figure out where they were shooting from, or B, be able to catch up with them, because, of course, they were on skis and the Germans were not. So it was a pretty brilliant tactic, and it really affected the morale of the Germans. So by January 31st of 1943, the German commander that's in Stalingrad is like, well, we're done, and they are going to surrender. Now, all told, in the Battle of Stalingrad alone, Russians are going to lose about 1.1 million troops. Now, that's a pretty big deal. In fact, we'll talk about this more later, but Russia will lose more troops than any other country involved in World War II. All told, Russia will lose right around 16 million troops. That's a pretty big number, but like I said, more on that later. All right, so then it's this point that the Soviet army begins to move west towards Germany. Now, that's a pretty big deal because it will also be the Soviet army that will be the first ones to liberate a concentration camp. And so when they find that out, what was happening to the Jewish people, they will be really mad. And they will also be the first group to get to Berlin. So they're going to completely surround Berlin. All right, so then at this point, we decided, while this is all going on, we want to try to divert some of Hitler's troops away from Russia. And so we began to attack Hitler in North Africa. We thought that was perhaps one of the best places to do that. So we're going to try to divert his troops from Russia by attacking him in North Africa. Now, the troops that we send over there are commanded by an American general by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, we've already talked about him a little bit. He was involved in the Bonus Army attack. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower and another general we'll talk about later, General Douglas MacArthur, were the commanders involved of the military that was instructed to get the Bonus Army out of Washington, D.C. Eisenhower was the one that gave the order to use bayonets and tear gas to try to get them evacuated. So anyway, there's some not good stuff in Eisenhower's past, but on the other hand, he will also become a pretty good general here. He'll be in charge of the D-Day invasion. He'll be in charge of the North Africa campaign. And then on top of that, later on, he will become president. November of 1942, 107,000 Allied troops are going to land in three major cities in North Africa: Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. And so they are going to spread eastward and start chasing after Hitler's troops in Africa, called the Afrika Korps. And yes, I know it's misspelled. It's misspelled for a reason. That's the German version of Africa. So the Afrika Korps was led by a general by the name of Erwin Rommel, he was also known as the Desert Fox. We call him that because he was such a tricky person. Now, I want to point out too that Erwin Rommel, if any one of Germany's leaders deserves any respect, it's probably Erwin Rommel, because Erwin Rommel was, for all intents and purposes, he didn't buy into the whole idea behind Nazism. And in fact, when he was given the order to extinguish or to kill Jewish people, he would refuse to do it. And so ultimately, Erwin Rommel was perhaps one of the more respectable German generals. In fact, later on, in the early parts of 1943, he would try to lead a plan in which they attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler, but it was found out, and so Erwin Rommel was recalled to Berlin, where he was put on trial, and then he was executed. So anyway, we'll chase them around Africa for a time, but then May of 1943, we will have completely taken over North Africa from the Afrika Korps. All right, so from there, then we're going to focus on Italy in what's known as the Italian campaign. So the Allied nations, that would be FDR here and Winston Churchill here, are going to meet in Casablanca, and they're going to try to decide, what do we do next? What's our next course of action? So they decide, rather than just straight up assault Hitler, we want to take over Italy, and we want to start by taking over Sicily. Okay, and if you remember, we talked about this already a little bit, but to take over Sicily, which was heavily defended at the time, they needed to have basically a ruse. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to convince Hitler and Mussolini that they were taking over either Sardinia or Greece. And so they had that British officer, the dead British officer, the body, they had taken it and they'd given him a fake name. They gave him some cash. They gave him some love letters. And then they gave him like a top secret telegram that was coded, talking about how they wanted to take over Sardinia and Greece, and with kind of an approximate date to it. Then they took that body and they dumped it off a submarine off the coast of Spain. And when it washed ashore, the Spanish found it and they turned it over to Hitler, especially the top secret letter, which said they were invading Sardinia or Greece. And so Italy and Germany will take their troops from Sicily and they'll move them to Sardinia and Greece. And then, of course, we will invade Sicily. So that happens in the summer of 1943. We've captured it, but that stuns the Italian government, and that especially stuns the Italian people. By July of 1943, on July 25th, the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel, this guy right here, he is no longer impressed with Benito Mussolini. He summons him to the palace. Here's Mussolini, back of his head anyway. Summons him to the palace. He strips him of his power and he has him arrested. He then informs him, you are the most hated man in Italy. He puts him on trial where he is found guilty of crimes against Italy. He is executed, and then, just because, shooting him by firing squad wasn't enough, they will hang him upside down in the middle square of Rome for a couple of days, in which they then cut him down, tie him behind a horse, and they'll drag him through the streets of Rome. Now, they were so mad at Mussolini for this loss of Sicily and the attack by the Allied powers in Italy, that not only will they execute him, but they will also execute his wife and his entire secretarial staff too. So yeah, you're mad when your entire secretarial staff gets executed as well. All right, so Hitler then is going to try to stop them. He'll send a strong force south to stop them, and they will meet at a place called Anzio. And the Battle of Bloody Anzio lasts for about 4 months. The Germans are finally defeated. They'll finally surrender, but in the process, 25,000 Allied troops and 30,000 Axis troops end up getting killed. Now, the Battle of Bloody Anzio also has another distinction in history. It is the battle in which more artillery was used than in any other battle in world history. So if you look, this picture right here shows artillery shells laying in front of this guy, and this is but a small portion of artillery shells. There was millions upon millions upon millions of artillery shells fired in this particular battle. Now, if you look as well, this picture up here shows what's left of the city of Anzio, okay, which is obviously not much. And as well, you've got German troops surrendering here and here. So, all right, next time we will talk about the Battle of Europe. And like I said before, make sure you get these written down in your notes.